June 18th, 1944, Sonoma County, California. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not blood, not smoke, not disinfectant or rusted iron. It was crushed grapes, sweet and sharp at the same time, warm from the sun, mixed with the bitter scent of American coffee and the faint sting of gasoline from a truck idling nearby. It was a smell that didn't belong to war. It belonged to harvests, to mornings, to places where people planned for tomorrow. I remember thinking, this is wrong, because prisons do not smell like fruit. I stood at the edge of the vineyard with my hands hanging freely at my sides. No rope, no cuffs, no rifle pressed into my back, just fabric sleeves rolled up against the heat and dirt under my boots that felt dry and honest beneath my soles. The sun was high, bright in a way I had only ever seen in postcards. Rows of grapevines stretched out in perfect lines, disciplined and patient, their leaves catching the light like polished glass. At the far end stood a white wooden house with peeling paint and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle, as if it had learned to relax. I was a German prisoner of war, and nothing about this place made sense. Somewhere behind me, a radio crackled to life. Static first, then music. Big band, brass and rhythm. A tune I didn't know, but somehow recognized in my bones. It sounded confident, unafraid, like a country that believed it would still be standing tomorrow. A man laughed, not loudly, just once. The kind of laugh people make without thinking about it. I flinched anyway. In Europe, laughter around prisoners meant someone was about to be humiliated or hurt. But no one was looking at me. A pair of American workers passed by carrying empty crates. One of them nodded at me. Not sharply, not cautiously, just a nod. As if I belonged there. As if I were another worker waiting for instructions. My throat tightened. I had prepared myself for many things during the weeks of transport. I had rehearsed fear the way one practices a prayer. I expected shouting, orders barked in a language I barely understood. I expected dirt, hunger, and the slow erasure of dignity that comes when you are reminded every hour that you are less than human. What I had not prepared for was this. A guard stood nearby, leaning against a fence post. He was chewing something, gum, I would later learn, his rifle resting loosely at his side. He looked bored, not cruel, not vigilant, just tired. When he noticed me staring, he raised his chin slightly and said, "You'll be working over there today." Over there? He pointed not with the barrel of his gun but with two fingers, as if directing a guest. That was the moment the shock truly landed. This did not look like punishment. I was 21 years old. I had worn a uniform since I was 17. I had learned, very early, how to read danger in the smallest gestures, the tightening of a jaw, the pause before a sentence, the way a hand hovered near a weapon. Here I read nothing. Someone handed me a pair of metal shears. The handle was smooth from years of use, warm from the sun. "Careful," a woman said in accented English. "They're sharp." She smiled, briefly, not kindly, not unkindly, just normally. My fingers closed around the tool before my mind could object. The metal felt solid, real, not symbolic, not theatrical. I bent down, cut my first cluster of grapes and placed it gently into a wooden bin. The grapes were heavier than they looked. Full. Alive. Juice ran down my wrist, sticky and purple. I wiped it on my sleeve out of habit, then froze. In Germany, sleeves like this had not existed for months. Fabric had been saved. Reused. Patched until it no longer remembered what it was supposed to be. Here, the cotton was thick, clean, soft. At midday, someone called for a break. Not a command, a suggestion. We sat in the shade. Someone passed me a sandwich wrapped in paper. White bread, thick slices, ham, cheese, white bread. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for a catch that did not come. When I finally took a bite, the taste flooded my mouth. Soft, bland, comforting. It tasted like nothing extraordinary, which made it extraordinary. I drank water from a metal cup. It was cold, so cold it hurt my teeth. I had not felt that sensation in years. Around me, the vineyard continued its quiet rhythm. Shears cutting, bins filling, music drifting in and out between stations, the world moving forward as if war were a rumor instead of a fact. I kept waiting for someone to shout, for the illusion to collapse, for the truth to reveal itself. But the hours passed, and nothing happened. As the sun lowered, the light softened, turning the rows of vines gold. A truck arrived to take us back. No head count screamed, no insults, just names spoken aloud, one by one. When mine was called, I answered automatically. Yes. That night, lying on a simple bed beneath a cotton blanket that smelled faintly of soap, I stared at the wooden ceiling and tried to understand what had happened to me. I'd been captured by the enemy, transported across an ocean, delivered into the hands of a nation I had been taught to fear. And instead of chains, they had given me work. Instead of hunger, they had given me bread. Instead of punishment, they had given me this. I turned onto my side, my fingers still stained purple, my hands aching not from blows, but from labor. This was supposed to be a prison, so why did it feel like the beginning of something else? That night, I did not sleep. I lay still beneath the cotton blanket, listening, not for sounds, but for meaning. In Europe, silence was never empty. Silence meant something was being prepared. A list, a transport, an execution. You learned quickly that kindness, when it appeared at all, was never accidental. I stared at the wooden beams above my bed and waited for the moment when the truth would finally reveal itself. It had to come. Because nothing that happened that day made sense. The next morning, I woke before the others. Habit. In camps, waking late meant punishment. I sat up sharply, my heart already racing, and waited for the shout that never came. Instead, I heard birds. Real birds. Not the mechanical whine of aircraft engines. Not the distant thunder of artillery. Just birds, arguing with each other in the trees beyond the farmhouse. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and touched the floor. Cold wood, solid. No chains rattling. No boots marching past my door. I told myself not to relax. This is how they get you, I thought. They let you forget where you are. I had grown up on stories like this. At school, they taught us that Americans smiled before they killed you, that they pretended to care so you would let your guard down, that they treated prisoners well only long enough to extract labor, information, obedience. Never trust their friendliness, our instructor used to say. It is a performance. By 17, I had already seen enough to believe him. I had seen bombed cities where streets no longer existed, only directions. I had stepped over bodies that were once neighbors. I had watched men disappear behind barbed wire and never return. I had learned that survival depended on one thing: suspicion. So when an American guard knocked lightly on the doorframe that morning instead of kicking it open, my stomach tightened. Breakfast, he said, just that, no order, no threat. We ate at a long wooden table, oatmeal, milk, coffee so strong it made my eyes water. I drank it anyway. The bitterness reminded me of home, of mornings before the war when my mother believed bitterness built character. Around the table, the other women spoke quietly, their eyes darting, their shoulders still tense. No one trusted this. After breakfast, we were loaded onto the truck again. The same one from yesterday. No shouting, no counting out loud. Names were called, not numbers. Hearing my name spoken by a man in an American uniform made my skin prickle. Names were dangerous. Names made you visible. In camps, visibility was a liability. As we rode back to the vineyard, I noticed things I hadn't allowed myself to see the day before. The roads were smooth, maintained, fields stretched out on either side, orderly and green. Farmhouses stood intact, their windows unbroken, laundry fluttering in the breeze like flags of a different war entirely. This country had not been flattened. This country had not been starved. In 1944, while Europe was tearing itself apart, America was planting. I knew enough history to understand what that meant. The United States had climbed out of the Great Depression with its sleeves rolled up. Factories ran day and night. Women filled assembly lines, welding planes, building tanks, packing ammunition. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda to them. She was real. And while their sons fought overseas, someone still had to harvest food. Someone still had to keep the land alive. That was when the realization crept in, unwanted and unsettling. We are useful. Useful people are not punished immediately. Useful people are preserved. At the vineyard, the work began again. Same rhythm, same quiet. The guards stayed back, leaning against their vehicles, talking among themselves. One of them smoked, exhaling slowly, as if time itself were not an enemy. I kept waiting for them to intervene, to correct us harshly, to remind us who we were. They did not. Instead, the owner arrived. He walked toward us without hesitation, his hat pushed back on his head, his hands empty. He stopped in front of me and held out his hand. "I'm John," he said. "You'll be in this row today." I stared at his hand. In my world, hands like that were reserved for equals, for agreements, for people who mattered. I shook it before I could stop myself. His grip was firm, warm, brief. He looked me directly in the eyes when he spoke. Not through me, not over me. That frightened me more than shouting ever could have. Throughout the morning, small things continued to unsettle me. A guard asked if the sun was too strong and suggested we take a break in the shade. A worker corrected my technique gently, demonstrating instead of scolding. Someone laughed again. Every instinct told me to stay alert. No one is kind for free. By midday, my shoulders ached, but it was a familiar ache. The ache of work, not punishment. When lunch came, I forced myself to eat slowly, deliberately, as if restraint might somehow protect me. I watched the Americans carefully. They did not watch us. They talked about weather, about crops, about a cousin stationed somewhere in France, about a letter that hadn't arrived yet. Their concerns sounded normal. That was the most terrifying thing of all. Because normality is dangerous when you have learned to survive chaos. That afternoon, as I carried a full bin toward the truck, my foot caught on a root. I stumbled, just barely managing not to fall. The bin tipped, grapes spilling onto the dirt. I froze. In camps, spilled food meant punishment. John appeared beside me almost instantly. He crouched, gathering grapes back into the bin with his bare hands. "It's all right," he said. "Happens all the time." He smiled, not broadly, not performatively, just enough to soften the moment. My chest tightened. This was wrong. All of it was wrong. That evening, back at the farmhouse, I sat on my bed and replayed every interaction, searching for the hidden blade beneath the velvet. There had to be one. Because if this was genuine, if Americans truly believed that treating prisoners with dignity was not weakness but strength, then everything I had been taught was incomplete. And incomplete truths are far more dangerous than lies. As darkness settled outside the windows, the radio downstairs hummed softly, carrying news from a world that still burned. I lay back, my hands sore, my mind racing. Kindness, I decided, was not mercy. Kindness was strategy, and strategies always came with a cost. I closed my eyes and made myself a promise. I would not forget who I was. I would not confuse comfort with safety. Because whatever this place was, vineyard, farmhouse, sunlight, it was still a prison. And prisons, no matter how gentle they seemed, were designed to remind you of one thing in the end. You did not belong. Not here, not anywhere. On the fourth morning, I realized I was no longer waiting for the blow. That frightened me more than fear ever had. Fear had rules. Fear kept you sharp. Fear reminded you who you were supposed to be in a place like this. Small, silent, replaceable. But this other feeling, this loosening in my chest when the sun rose and no one shouted my name, was unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory is where soldiers get lost. We rode to the vineyard as usual. Same truck, same dust curling up behind the tires. But something had changed. I noticed it when the radio crackled on before the engine fully warmed. Allied forces have secured the beaches in Normandy. The voice was calm, matter of fact, no triumph, no panic. D-Day. The word moved through the air like electricity. The Americans didn't cheer. They didn't stop working. Someone adjusted the dial and a swing tune slipped in behind the news, horns bright and unapologetic. The war was still happening. But life here did not pause to honor it. At the vineyard, John gathered us near the first row. He did not stand above us. He stood with us, boots in the same dirt, sleeves rolled the same way. "All right," he said, "let's walk through it." He showed us how to cut the clusters at the stem. Not too close, not too far. He explained why bruised fruit mattered. He demonstrated how to carry the bins so the weight sat on the hips, not the back. He did not say, "Do this." He said, "This works better." That difference landed quietly, like a stone dropped into deep water. I had followed orders for years. Orders were blunt instruments. They demanded obedience, not understanding. Here, for the first time since the war began, someone explained why. "Is this too heavy for you?" he asked one of the women, nodding at her bin. She hesitated. In camps, hesitation was an admission of weakness. He waited. She nodded once. "Swap with me," he said to a younger worker nearby. "We'll even it out." No punishment, no commentary, just adjustment. I kept my eyes on my hands, half expecting the correction to be followed by something else. It never was. The guards stayed back again, their presence more symbolic than controlling. One of them read a folded newspaper during our break. Another cleaned his boots with a rag that looked older than the war itself. At lunch, we sat beneath the vines. Someone passed around sandwiches wrapped in brown paper. Thick slices of white bread pressed around meat and cheese, heavy in the hands. Apples followed, milk in dented metal cups. I watched how the Americans, you ate. They ate like people who expected another meal tomorrow. That realization shifted something inside me. In Europe, food had become an event, a negotiation, a risk. Here it was routine, a pause between tasks, not a prize for surviving the morning. The radio returned, swing music again, then a baseball score read aloud as if it mattered more than tanks and borders. I did not understand the teams, but I understood the tone. This country spoke about war the way it spoke about weather. Important, dangerous, temporary. The afternoon passed without incident. My shoulders burned. My palms smarted where the shears rubbed them raw. It was honest pain, the kind that arrives after effort, not humiliation. Near the end of the day, John walked the rows again, stopping occasionally to comment, not to criticize. "Good cut." "Careful there. That bin's full. Bring it down." When he reached me, he paused. "You've got a steady hand," he said. "You ever worked with plants before?" I shook my head. "My father worked with stone." He considered this, then nodded. "That makes sense. You respect material." Respect. He said it like it was a skill. That night, back at the farmhouse, I sat on the porch steps and rubbed salve into my hands. The wood beneath me was rough, splintered in places. The air smelled like cut grass and distant smoke from a chimney. One of the women joined me. She said nothing for a while. Then quietly, as if speaking might break something fragile, she said, "I think they're serious." "About what?" I asked. "About this being just work." I wanted to argue. I searched for the familiar armor of suspicion. It didn't fit as tightly anymore. The next day confirmed it. Camp credits were handed out, small slips of paper officially recorded. Payment. For labor. I stared at mine longer than necessary. Paid prisoners. The phrase sounded like a mistake. Sunday came, and with it, the strangest development of all. We did not work. No trucks, no bins, no shears. Some went to chapel, some stayed behind, mending clothes, washing hair in basins filled with clean water. I walked to the edge of the property and stood there, uncertain what to do with unstructured time. In camps, free time was dangerous. It left room for thoughts. Across the field, John worked on a fence. Alone. Not supervising, just repairing a post that had come loose. I approached slowly. "Do you need help?" I asked. He looked surprised, then smiled. "If you want." I held the post steady while he hammered. The sound rang sharp and clean in the open air. When he finished, he wiped his hands on his trousers. "You don't have to," he said. "It's your day." I nodded. "I know." That afternoon, I wrote a letter I did not send. I described the work, the food, the way people spoke to me without anger. I did not know how to explain the rest. By the end of the week, the search for the hidden cruelty had become exhausting. I replayed moments again and again, waiting for them to reveal their true purpose. But the days remained stubbornly ordinary. Work, break, work. No humiliation, no sudden reversals. If this was cruelty, I did not recognize it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the vineyard turned copper, I stood at the end of my row and watched the light move across the leaves. I realized I was breathing more deeply than I had in years. That realization scared me, because breathing like this, without counting, without bracing, felt dangerously close to trust. And trust, I had been taught, was the most expensive mistake a prisoner could make. Still, as we climbed onto the truck at dusk, tired and quiet, something undeniable settled in my chest. They were not trying to break us. They were trying to use us. And in doing so, without speeches or slogans, they had done something far more unsettling. They had treated us like workers, like people whose effort mattered, like dignity could be earned not by allegiance, but by labor. I did not know yet what that would cost me. I only knew that for the first time since the war began, I was no longer waiting for punishment. I was learning how to work again. I didn't know how to be human anymore. The breaking point did not arrive with violence. It arrived quietly, on a morning that looked exactly like all the others. That was how I knew something was wrong. I had stopped counting the days. At first, I told myself it was discipline, an old habit from the camps, a refusal to let time soften me. But as the weeks passed, I realized the truth was more dangerous than that. Nothing was changing, and nothing not changing was what undid me. The vineyard moved through its routines with an almost cruel consistency. Work in the morning, breaks at regular intervals, lunch beneath the vines. The radio murmuring news and music as if war were something happening far away, to other people. Normality stretched on, uninterrupted. There was no punishment waiting behind it, no reversal, no moment when the mask slipped. And without those things, I found myself unarmed. The first crack came on an afternoon when the light was too bright and my thoughts too slow. I was bent over a row of vines, focused on my work when someone spoke behind me. I startled so sharply that the shears slipped from my hand and clattered against the dirt. "I'm sorry," John said immediately. "Didn't mean to scare you." He stepped back, hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in instinctive apology. For a second, I didn't understand what had happened. Then it hit me. He was apologizing, not asserting authority, not correcting behavior. Apologizing. My heart pounded as if I had been caught doing something wrong, but there was no accusation in his face, only concern. I nodded too quickly and returned to my work, my fingers shaking just enough to make the cuts uneven. I told myself it meant nothing. It meant everything. A few days later, a cold front moved in unexpectedly. The mornings turned sharp, the air biting through our thin clothing. I worked without complaint, shoulders tight, hands stiff. At lunch, a woman I barely knew, a farmhand with sun-lined skin and hair pinned back in a practical knot, stopped in front of me. "Here," she said, holding out a sweater. It was wool, thick, clearly mended at the elbow. I hesitated. "I won't need it later," she added. "You look cold." No one had ever noticed whether I was cold before. I took it without speaking. When I pulled it on, the warmth settled over my shoulders like something almost unbearable. I kept my eyes down until she walked away. The sweater smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. That night I folded it neatly at the foot of my bed and stared at it as if it might accuse me of something. It never did. Then there were the names. Names without titles. Not Fräulein, not prisoner, not German. Just my name. Spoken plainly, casually, without emphasis. Hearing it used that way felt like stepping onto uneven ground. Titles, even cruel ones, gave structure. They told you how to behave, what was expected. A name, alone, asked something else entirely. It asked you to be present. I began to notice how often people spoke to me as if my answers mattered. What do you think? Does this make sense? Have you ever seen anything like this? Each question landed like a blow, not because it hurt, but because I didn't know how to respond. No one had asked me anything about myself in years. Not what I thought, not what I remembered, not who I had been before the uniform. The breakdown came on a Thursday, unremarkable in every way. The sky was overcast, the air heavy, my movements slower than usual. I was carrying a full bin when a sharp pain shot through my palm. I dropped it instinctively, clutching my hand as blood welled between my fingers. I stared at it, detached. Blood had never frightened me. Blood was familiar. Blood was expected. John reached me before I could move. "Sit," he said gently, guiding me toward the edge of the row. I obeyed without thinking. He knelt, tore a strip from a clean cloth and wrapped my hand with careful precision. His hands were steady, practiced. "You'll be all right," he said. "It's not deep." The words were ordinary. The tone was not. It was the tone someone uses when they care whether you will be all right. That was when the wall finally collapsed. I felt it before I understood it. A pressure behind my eyes, a tightness in my throat that refused to be swallowed. John looked up, confused. "Did I hurt you?" I shook my head, but the motion dislodged something inside me. The tears came without warning. Not loud, not dramatic. They spilled over, hot and uncontrollable, blurring the world until the vineyard dissolved into color and light. I tried to stop them. I pressed my lips together, my free hand clenching in my lap. It didn't matter. Years of restraint, of silence, of necessary hardness gave way all at once. John froze. He started, then stopped. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's not you," I said, though the words barely made it out. I couldn't finish. He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Do you want to talk about it?" That question undid me completely, because it wasn't rhetorical. He was waiting for an answer. I stared at my hands, one wrapped, one shaking, and something inside me cracked open. "I don't remember," I said, the truth escaping before I could stop it. "I don't remember how to be anything else." He said nothing. He didn't rush me. He didn't fill the silence. So I continued. "I used to be someone," I said. "Before the war, I had a family, a home. I knew what I liked, what I wanted." My voice wavered. "Now, I only know how to survive." John listened as if this mattered, as if I mattered. "Tell me about your family," he said. The question landed softly and shattered me. I cried harder then, my shoulders shaking, my breath coming apart in uneven pieces. No one had asked me that since before the bombings. Not in camps, not on transport ships, not during interrogations. Family was dangerous territory. Family reminded you of what you could lose, but here, in a vineyard thousands of miles from everything I had known, someone had asked simply because he wanted to know. I told him. Fragments at first. A father who worked with his hands. A mother who baked bread before flour disappeared. A brother whose face I could no longer picture clearly. The words came haltingly, clumsily, as if spoken in a language I hadn't used in years. John didn't interrupt. When I finished, he tied the bandage more securely and said, "Thank you for telling me." Thank you. Not "I'm sorry," not "that's hard." Thank you. That night I lay awake again. but this time, not in vigilance. In grief. Grief for the person I had been forced to set aside in order to endure. Grief for the realization that somewhere along the way, I had forgotten how to exist as a human being instead of a prisoner. The next morning, the vineyard looked the same. The work waited. The radio played. But I was different. Because the trap I had been searching for, the cruelty hidden beneath kindness, had never been there. What I had mistaken for strategy was something far more dangerous. They had treated me like a person long enough for me to remember what that meant. And once you remember, you cannot go back. That was the true breaking point. Not pain, not fear, but the unbearable weight of being seen. I expected the morning after the breakdown to feel different. I expected shame, or distance, or the quiet discomfort people carry when something too honest has been said out loud. Instead, the vineyard woke exactly as it always had. The same pale light slipped between the rows. The same radio hummed to life, arguing briefly with static before settling on a familiar tune. The same smell of coffee drifted from the farmhouse, followed by the sharper scent of earth warming under the sun. Nothing had changed. That was the moment I began to understand. John did not avoid me. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not soften his voice or treat me as something fragile that might break again. He handed me the shears. "Let me show you something," he said. No ceremony, no apology, no expectation of gratitude. Just work. He walked me to an older section of vines near the edge of the property, where the branches were thicker and the growth less forgiving. He crouched and pointed out the structure, the way one cane fed another, how cutting the wrong place could starve the vine months later. "This one stays," he said. "This one goes." I watched closely, my mind sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me, surprised, not by the question, but by how naturally it had come. "Because if you take too much," he said, "the vine panics. It throws everything into survival instead of fruit." I nodded. The metaphor was impossible to miss. He handed the shears back to me. "Your turn." I hesitated only once, then made the cut. "Good," he said. "You're paying attention." That word stayed with me the rest of the day. Attention. Not obedience, not submission. Attention. As the hours passed, something unfamiliar took root. I wasn't working because I was ordered to. I was working because the work itself made sense, because effort led to visible results, because care mattered. At lunch, I found myself explaining a technique to another woman without thinking, showing her how to brace the bin against her thigh to save her back. She listened. She tried it. It worked. "Thanks," she said. "No rank, no hierarchy, just exchange." The radio interrupted with news again. Updates from Europe. Names of towns I recognized for all the wrong reasons. Normandy. Caen. St. Louis. The Americans listened, nodded, then turned the volume down. "We'll hear more tonight," someone said. "Food will get cold." The war, I realized, did not consume everything here. It existed. It mattered. But it did not erase the rest of life. That afternoon, John asked if I wanted to learn how to repair a broken trellis. "You don't have to," he said, "but if you're interested." I was. He showed me how to replace the wire, how to tension it so it would hold through the season without snapping. My hands moved confidently, memory waking up where fear had lived. "You've got a good sense for this," he said. "You learn fast." I waited for the follow-up, the expectation, the condition. It didn't come. By the end of the week, I noticed the shift fully. No one asked me to apologize. No one asked me to explain where I came from or what uniform I had worn. No one asked me to prove remorse. They asked me if I could handle a heavier load, if I wanted to learn irrigation, if I had ideas about organizing the bins more efficiently. The Americans did not need my guilt. They needed my work. That realization rearranged something fundamental inside me. Back home, worth had been conditional. You belonged. if you believed the right things, if you repeated the right words, if you stood on the correct side of a line someone else had drawn. Here, belonging was built differently. It was earned slowly, quietly, through consistency. One evening, as we packed up for the day, John leaned against the truck and watched us finish. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "people think being hard makes you strong." I didn't respond. I had learned not to interrupt moments like this. "But it's the opposite," he continued. "Hard just makes people smaller." He looked at me then, directly. "If I treat you like an animal, you'll live like one," he said. "If I treat you like a person, you decide what you become." The words settled between us, heavy and precise. He wasn't talking about me. He was talking about the way he understood the world. That night, I walked the perimeter of the vineyard alone, the sky darkening overhead. The air carried the smell of leaves and dust, of work completed and work waiting. I realized something then that frightened me more than captivity ever had. I was no longer measuring my days by survival. I was measuring them by contribution. The following weeks deepened the change. I learned how to read the vines, how to see stress before it showed, how to anticipate what the plants would need rather than react after damage was done. I learned the rhythms of the land, the quiet logic of seasons that did not care about borders or flags. I began to speak more, not about the war, about the work. I asked questions, I offered suggestions, I corrected mistakes when I saw them. No one punished me for confidence. No one resented initiative. On Sundays when we didn't work, I found myself restless, not from fear, but from absence. I walked into town with a small group once, under guard but unhurried, and watched Americans live their lives. Families in church clothes, children licking ice cream despite the chill, a hardware store window stacked neatly with tools. This was what freedom looked like here, not the absence of rules, but the presence of trust. That was when the final realization arrived, not all at once, but like a tide you don't notice until your feet are wet. Freedom, as I had understood it, was something taken. Here, it was something offered and then respected. No one was forcing me to change. No one was asking me to become American. They were simply giving me room to choose who I would be when no one was watching. I thought back to the camps, to the endless lines, to the way cruelty reduced people until survival became the only language left. Here, survival was not enough. Here, I was expected to decide. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the vineyard turned bronze, John handed me a ledger. "Can you track the output from the east rows?" he asked. "You've got the eye for it." I took it without hesitation. In that moment, without ceremony or declaration, I crossed an invisible line. I was no longer just enduring my captivity. I was shaping my days. I was choosing attention over suspicion, work over waiting, human over prisoner. As I closed the ledger and followed the others toward the truck, the thought came to me clearly, without bitterness or irony. Maybe this is what they mean by freedom. Not flags, not speeches, but the quiet expectation that if you are treated like a person, you will act like one, and that what you become after that is up to you. The first time I returned, I almost missed the turn. The road was narrower than I remembered. The paint on the sign had faded until the name of the town looked unsure of itself. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the pavement where delivery trucks once rumbled through without pause. 38 years had passed. The factory at the edge of town, the one that had run day and night while we picked grapes and listened to swing music, stood silent now. Its windows were broken, its doors chained shut. Rust bled down the metal siding like old wounds reopening. I parked across the street and sat there longer than necessary. In 1944, that factory had meant something. It had meant work, purpose. Paychecks folded carefully into envelopes and carried home to kitchens that smelled of coffee and hope. It had meant women on assembly lines, sleeves rolled up, doing their part while sons and husbands fought overseas. It had meant motion. Now it meant memory. I drove on. The vineyard appeared the same way it always had, quietly, without announcement. The rows were still straight, the land still patient, the house still white, though the porch sagged a little more now, as if age had finally caught up to it. Some things endure. I stepped out of the car and walked between the vines, my hand brushing the leaves out of habit. The work had changed me in ways time could not undo. Even now, decades later, my body remembered the rhythm. I remembered the radio voices floating over the fields, news from Normandy, from Italy, from places that felt impossibly far away and dangerously close all at once. I remembered how the Americans had listened, quietly, attentively, then gone back to work. They had believed in labor then, not as punishment, not as identity, but as something shared. In 1944, America felt unified in a way that is difficult to explain now. Heavy, unresolved, and necessary. I wonder what happened to that America, and whether somewhere beneath the noise of the present it is waiting to be remembered again. Some gifts don't rust. The letter was written long after the vineyard had learned her hands by heart. It was written at a kitchen table far from California by someone who had never worn a uniform, never heard bombs, never learned to survive by suspicion alone. It began simply. To the people of Sonoma County, you do not know my grandmother's name, but you changed her life. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind that belongs to someone who understands that words, once written, carry responsibility. The writer did not apologize. There was no attempt to explain history away, no defense, no justification, only gratitude. She arrived in your country as a prisoner of war. She expected punishment. She expected to be broken. Instead, you gave her work. The letter paused there, as if the sentence itself needed space to breathe. Not charity, not forgiveness, just work. The granddaughter wrote about the stories she grew up hearing. Not heroic tales, not battles or victories, but small moments. A man explaining how to prune a vine instead of ordering it done. A woman lending a sweater without asking for anything in return. A ledger placed in careful hands, trusting accuracy over allegiance. You did not ask her to be grateful, the letter continued. You did not ask her to repent. You asked her to show up. That, the granddaughter explained, had been enough. The vineyard became a family business. The skills learned there were passed down like heirlooms. How to read soil, how to respect seasons, how to work without humiliation. Children grew up understanding that dignity could be rebuilt, one day at a time. Some gifts don't rust, she wrote. They don't fade with time. They don't depend on memory. They become habits. They become values. They become the way a family lives. The letter ended without ceremony. No plea, no demand. Just a quiet acknowledgement that history is often remembered through its loudest moments. Victories, defeats, dates carved into stone. But lives are shaped by quieter things. By how strangers behave when no one is watching. By how a nation treats those who arrive. Differences existed, of course, but they bent inward toward a common purpose. People argued, yes, but they argued within a frame they all recognized. You worked, you contributed, you trusted that effort mattered. Standing there now, I wondered when that belief had begun to fracture. In town, the diner where we used to stop on Sundays was gone, replaced by a boarded-up storefront with a handwritten sign promising reopening that never came. The hardware store still stood, but half its shelves were empty, and the man behind the counter watched the door more than the customers. People spoke differently now. Their voices carried tension where there had once been resolve. Conversations felt sharper, quicker to turn defensive. The easy assumption of goodwill, the thing that had undone me all those years ago, seemed harder to find. I did not blame them. Time changes a country the way weather changes land. Slowly, then all at once. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. In 1944, America had been confident enough to treat its enemies with dignity, confident enough to believe that decency was not weakness, confident enough to trust work as a bridge between strangers. Now, that confidence felt thinner. I walked back into the vineyard and sat on the same low wall where I once bandaged my hands after long days. The stone was warmer than I expected, holding the heat of the afternoon like a memory that refused to cool. I thought about the ledger I had first been handed, about the trust implicit in that simple act. I thought about how little had been asked of me. No apologies, no declarations, no performances of remorse, just effort, just consistency, just the expectation that if you were treated like a person, you would act like one. That assumption had changed the course of my life, and I wondered, not for the first time, what had happened to the America that believed so deeply in that idea. Perhaps it hadn't disappeared. Perhaps it had simply been buried beneath disappointment, beneath arguments that grew louder as listening grew rare. Perhaps it was still here, waiting in places like this, quiet fields, old porches, work done carefully by people whose names history would never remember. The factory might be closed, the town might be struggling, but the vineyard still produced fruit, still required hands, still rewarded attention. Legacy, I had learned, is not always loud. It doesn't always announce itself with monuments or parades. Sometimes it survives in habits passed down quietly, in standards maintained even when they are no longer fashionable. As I stood to leave, I looked back one last time at the rows stretching into the distance. This place had taught me something America once knew instinctively. That dignity is not granted by victory. That unity is not forged by force. That a nation is at its strongest not when it dominates, but when it trusts its values enough to live by them, even under strain. I wondered how many others remembered that version of America. How many still carried it quietly, the way I did. And as I drove away, past the shuttered factory and the fading signs, the question stayed with me, in its hands with nothing but fear. The granddaughter signed her name and folded the paper carefully. She mailed it without expectation of reply, because gratitude, she understood, was not a transaction. It was a recognition. Years later, when people ask her what America meant to her family, she does not speak about power or dominance or triumph. She speaks about trust. She speaks about work. She speaks about a country that believed dignity was not something you granted once, but something you practiced every day, even with your enemies. And when she finishes, she always returns to the same truth, the one her grandmother carried quietly to the end of her life. History remembers who won the war, but my family remembers who gave us work and trusted us to become human again. Some gifts don't rust. They live on, in hands that build, in families that remember, and in a nation that, once upon a time, believed deeply enough in its values to live by them, and maybe, if we remember, can again.